Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Julia Osman. I am the director of the Institute for the Humanities here at Mississippi State University, and I'm very happy to welcome you to this program on HBCUs and diversity and inclusion in education, more broadly speaking. And I'm joined today by two wonderful guests. First, there's Dr. Sheena Harris, who is an associate professor at West Virginia University, and also Leigh Soares, Dr. Leigh Soares, who's an assistant professor here at Mississippi State as well. Both of you, thank you so much for joining me today, and thank you for being willing to talk about this important topic. Would either of you like to just maybe first tell us a little bit more about yourselves? What are you working on right now? What are your experiences with HBCUs?
Okay, I'll go. Hi, I'm Dr. Leigh Soares. I'm an assistant professor of history here at Mississippi State University. I specialize in 19th and 20th century African American history. I'm currently writing a book about the relationship between Black politics and the South's first public Black colleges in the decades after the Civil War. I have not personally attended or worked at HBCUs, but like many Black Americans, I have lots of close family connections to HBCUs stretching back across generations, including Paul Quinn College in Texas, Central State University in Ohio, and Hampton University in Virginia. So thanks, Julia, for organizing this program, and I'm looking forward to having this discussion with you and Sheena and our audience members.
Hello, so I'm Sheena Harris. I am currently an associate professor of history at West Virginia University. I am new to West Virginia. I moved here in August. In terms of research and just fields of study, I just published a book on Booker T. Washington's third wife, Margaret Murray Washington, with the University Press of Tennessee this year. Now, my research, I'm looking at the gendered curriculum of Tuskegee, which is pushing me into Black migration and looking more so at the lives of his first two wives, who interestingly were from West Virginia as well. And I'm excited to be here. I am a graduate of Florida A&M University. I taught at Tuskegee, and of course, my book is on the educational practices in many ways at HBCUs and with women's clubs as well.
Great, thank you so much. It's really neat how your research is kind of connecting with the places that you're teaching right now. That's really great. So I'm just going to go ahead and dive right in. But before I do, I'd just like to quickly remind all of the folks out there who are listening or watching the program, if you have a question at any point about HBCUs or about any of the topics that we'll be conversing on, or diversity and inclusion in universities or race and education, feel free to just put that question in the comments area underneath the video on Facebook, and I'll do my best to incorporate it in the conversation. And feel free to leave comments there as well. Ideally, we'd be conversing easily with all of you in person, but I think we reach more people if we can keep it on Facebook Live. But just feel free to put comments and questions there, and we'll make sure to include it in the conversation. So Leigh, if I can just start with you, what exactly is an HBCU? When were HBCUs founded, and for what purpose?
So first, I just want to say that HBCU stands for Historically Black College or University. So for those of you who are just new to the acronym, that's what it stands for. Some Northern HBCUs predated the Civil War, but the majority of HBCUs, what we know today as HBCUs, were established in the former slaveholding South in the decades following the national abolition of slavery. And one thing, my research focuses primarily on public Black colleges. And one thing that I found in that research is that the early history of public HBCUs is closely linked to a broader story of expanding public education throughout the South. Black Americans made the growth of public education, including higher learning, central to their project of redefining citizenship in the period of Reconstruction that followed the Civil War. And that interest in education had long roots, right, dated back to the antebellum era, where in response to the way the system of slavery had worked to steal their labor, skills, and knowledge, right? So for a long time, literacy had represented freedom for Black Americans, but that took on urgent new meanings after emancipation, right? Because for free Black Americans, literacy meant being able to read labor contracts for themselves, participate in print culture. They could navigate modern roadways in search of job opportunities and lost loved ones. And then, of course, as voting rights and political participation expanded in the era of Reconstruction, schooling also marked a path toward becoming an independent, informed citizen. Right. So, in my work, I show that Black Southerners worked to make access to affordable education a civil right as opposed to a privilege that reserved for elites. And that was a crucial component of their agenda for Reconstruction, one that all Southerners benefited from. Oh, Sheena, you're muted.
Being unmuted could possibly help. But to add to what Leigh said as well, is that in 1837, you have the establishment of the first HBCU within the United States, known as African Institute, but now that we know as Cheney University. We know that during the 1850s, you also are going to have 3 HBCUs that are going to be formed a little bit prior to emancipation, and that's Minor Normal School, 1851, Lincoln University, and Wilberforce in 1856. And one of the interesting things about Wilberforce that's going to be founded by the African Methodist Episcopal Church is that it's going to be the first HBCU that's operated by African Americans. And this is we're going to see more of these as HBCUs are continuously being formed and flourishing as well. I think a couple of questions that I find that Black folk are really asking themselves during this time period is, what is education's purpose? Who controls this education? And what is the relationship of education to the broader aspects of Black people? And so I think that this in many ways is at the heart of HBCUs coming into formation, but also this legalized form of segregation, right? And so Black folks don't have access into PWIs, or historically white universities, at this particular time period. And I think when we're talking about the establishment of it, that it's important to mention that although these schools are historically predominantly Black, that they were never exclusive. And so that in itself is a very important component of its history. And I think we'll talk about the numbers as the time goes, because I think now about 24% of enrollment at HBCUs across the board is non-Black. And so I think that also speaks to its larger mission of providing access to education to underrepresented communities and populations as well. In terms of further establishment as well, is that, as Leigh also said, is that you also have just this large influx of HBCUs that are coming about after the Civil War. And after you have this emancipation of enslaved persons, and after the 13th Amendment. Folks are looking for, how do we read the Bible? How do we prove? And I think that that's going to be something that is this common thread as we're talking about HBCUs and Black bodies, is that there is this constant effort at proving these things, which some folk are just innately born into. You find these Black communities constantly having to show relevance for it. 89% of HBCUs are in the South, even though HBCUs are represented across the nation, just majority of them are in the South. And then also in terms of HBCU and the chronology of them, is that in more recent years, like the 1960s, you have the creation of Black institutions as well. And those are called predominantly Black institutions, which is PBI. However, they're still added into the 101 HBCUs that are documented. It's still in establishment today.
Great, Sheena. I'm glad you brought up the idea, the notion of legal segregation, because it's no accident that vast majority of HBCUs were in the former slaveholding South, where segregation was legalized. And I think I just want to add to that, that Black Americans had to struggle and scrape to build their own institutions because they were denied access to white schools in the South. But there weren't just push factors at play, right? There also were also pull factors. Black Southerners sought their own educational spaces, and I think sometimes that's hard for us to think about today from an era that sort of celebrates a more integrationist framework. But in the 19th century, less than a generation removed from slavery, Black Southerners in particular, but Black Americans more broadly, right, were seeking educational spaces where they could have some autonomy or offer students some protection from white prejudice in the classroom, and of course provide professional jobs for Black men and women as teachers, staff, and administrators, right? So it's not only a matter of being denied access to white schools, but also about the positive things that kind of having a Black institution could provide, especially in the 19th century, but I would argue remains important to this day.
Absolutely.
If I could ask a follow-up question on what you were just saying there, Leigh, you kind of brought up today. So you all provided a great kind of picture of education and kind of how HBCUs kind of served a very specific function when they were first founded. So what is the primary function of HBCUs today? Are people finding that they still need these kind of safer spaces or these kind of comfortable spaces to learn in? Can you talk a little bit more about what the goals or what the aims of HBCUs are right now?
Okay, you want me to start it off, Lee? All right. So we've kind of already gone over this idea that HBCUs that were formed in the late 1800s really were being formed out of these pull and push factors. Many HBCUs focused in the beginning on the ambitions of these newly freed people. Their curriculums, in many ways, had a particular focus on teachers, on priests, on farmers, on artisans, and yet the pursuit of education was not an individual undertaking in many ways. It was collective. For example, it was embedded mission to train Black teachers to provide an educational foundation, not only for themselves, but also for the surrounding Black communities, and to support economic and independence and self-sustainability. And so there are these connected missions that were at the heart of HBCUs being formed. And then even if we look at HBCUs today with those missions, today HBCUs represent only 2.3% of the total number of colleges in the United States. And despite those numbers, they enroll 10% of all African American students, and they graduate 20% of all African American graduates. That is a phenomenal feat. And the function of HBCUs, as I've already kind of mentioned, in the 21st century, just as it was when they were founded, are still multifaceted, right? They are the single most important incubator of the Black middle class and Black professionals. They create a national, unofficial network of graduates in communities across the country. And they continue to provide a learning environment that is affirming, based on a culture of care, not only for the students, but also in many ways for the communities that they service, but also care for the communities that the students are coming from. And so you kind of get that larger theme, I think, from the beginning of their establishment, but even woven into their missions today.
Great, thank you. So we're already getting some questions in on our Facebook chat. And since we just transitioned to talking about HBCUs today, but someone is asking a question about the 19th century. And so while we're in this phase of the conversation, I'll go ahead and ask that if that's all right. And so this question is from Reese Dunn, who asks, could you briefly talk about the Second Morrill Act in 1890?
What? Oh, go ahead, Leigh.
Sure, I can say a little bit about that. So the Second Morrill Act, also known as the Morrill Landgrant Act of 1890, is a moment where the federal government was trying to expand the reach of higher education. And the Second Morrill Act obviously followed the First Morrill Act, which was passed during the Civil War, and kind of led to the first wave of land-grant colleges in the United States. But one problem that the First Morrill Act had, perhaps an unintended consequence is a generous interpretation, was that it allowed states to have access to federal funds for higher education, but it only required them to establish one university that focused primarily on agricultural and mechanical instruction alongside other academic programs. And so in segregated states in the South, that meant Black students did not have access to those land-grant colleges, those early land-grant colleges like LSU in Louisiana, Virginia Tech, Auburn. So meanwhile, Black Southerners continued to try to lobby for a fair share of those federal funds that Southern states were getting, and they, really put pressure on Congress to kind of rework the Morrill Land-Grant Act. And so that led to the 1890 attempt, their second attempt, where they stipulated that that states could only have access to the federal funds if they, did not exclude Black Americans. So they did allow for segregated institutions, and so they said, to states, you can pick one white institution and one Black institution if you're not going to integrate your schools to receive a share of that funding. Of course, there were more shortcomings to that, as far as the law did not stipulate how funds would be divided between the two institutions. And so once again, you have sort of this gap between perhaps, intended effects of these laws and how they're being implemented on the ground. And, Black college leaders and state officials are negotiating, with federal officials as well, to really kind of work out, how those funds were going to be used. But overall, so I would say overall, the legacy of the Morrill Acts and the Second Morrill Act is quite ambivalent. I mean, on one hand, it did increase, federal support for Black colleges. It led to a state of like a kind of a second wave of public Black colleges, land-grant colleges in the South that were newly established in the 1890s and into the 20th century. Previously established schools could, lobby for a share of that aid, and that allowed them to expand their campus and their programming. But it also kind of lets states off the hook a little bit. We see a pattern of states reducing, the funding that they allocated to public Black colleges because they said, well, you're getting federal funds. And so, it was really quite an ambivalent sort of legacy. And of course, is relevant to us here at Mississippi State because Mississippi State is a land-grant college as well that was, established in 1878 to serve exclusively white male students.
If I could ask, or not me, but if I could put out a follow-up question to that, we have a second question which has popped up while you were talking, Leigh, which asks a little bit, you'd be a bit more precise on something. It says, and this is from Doris Soares. She says, how did the groups of Blacks who founded public HBCUs in the former slave states gain the support or funding from state legislatures? So you just mentioned that some state legislatures would reduce funding now that federal funding was involved. So how were they able to get any of that funding back or increase that funding over time? Is this still a problem now?
Thanks for that question. Yeah, so this is a great question, and one, it might seem surprising, and it certainly did to me when I kind of started down this path of research. The idea that, in the South after the Civil War, which, although we know that very quickly in the 1870s, for instance, right, conservative white elites like regain power in southern states. So how is it that these states supported the establishment of any public Black colleges? And I would say that one answer is about kind of the height of Reconstruction and the increased representation of Black Americans in the sort of political sphere. So you have Black delegates to early constitutional conventions in 1867 and 1868 that are, guaranteeing universal education for the first time in these states. And then you have, Black representatives on state boards of education who are able to advocate from within state positions. And then, of course, Black voters who are, making education a priority as their, as elected officials or those seeking office are, trying to court their votes. So there's that on one hand. And then on the other hand, there's the question of sort of different constituencies, different groups maybe having different visions for what these schools would do. And so you have a class of maybe more moderate or even conservative white Southerners who, don't necessarily mind the idea of Black education if it's going to train Black Americans, to be better laborers, more productive citizens, that this idea that maybe better classes should rule society, regardless of race. And while their vision did not match up with Black Americans' vision for Black colleges, Black educational activists could use kind of those ideas kind of rhetorically to make their case for the education of the higher education of Black Southerners.
And I think, Leigh, you did a great job of answering all of it. I think the only thing that I would just add to it is, yes, what we see is that you have these public institutions and some private that have some public benefits to them, but they're not getting equal amounts. So even if they provide the same type of curriculum that a white institution that is state run is providing, they're not getting the same amount. And so I think just historically, at HBCUs, they are expected to perform at a very high level with less resources and less aid. And so oftentimes, especially at the turn of the century, you have a number of Black administrators that are going out to solicit funds for themselves for those institutions. And so, yes, you have this limited funding that's happening in terms of the state giving these schools monies, and also when they're giving them these monies, dictating the types of educations that they are giving. And I think to Leigh's point also is that it was far more comfortable for especially white Southerners to think about this idea of education if it's going to produce a working or a service class. But thinking of Black folk getting education when at the end of emancipation, I think that there is often this myth that white folk are all educated and that Black folk are not. And so I think with that myth, it also feeds into other things. But at that particular time, public education, everyone is attempting to get free public education. It's not just formerly enslaved Blacks who are attempting to get it, even though that struggle is far more difficult. There is a very large illiterate population that's happening. And at the expense that if Black folk and white folk are both going to be in schools, there needs to be this idea of inferiority that is embedded into those institutions so that they can be promoted and accepted in society.
If I could ask a quick follow-up question with what you all have been talking about, because Leigh, the way you were describing things, it sounded very much like at the beginning, or at the foundation of these HBCUs, that it was primarily to help people kind of work within this system that they were now allowed to work in to a limited degree, and how to work within that system, being teachers and becoming fuller citizens, and starting to exercise those rights that they are now supposed to have. And then Dr. Harris, you were talking about, how there was still supposed to be this inequality, this assumed inequality within the institutions that, Black institutions are supposed to be teaching these kinds of things, whereas, white institutions are supposed to be teaching, kind of higher things or something like that. So I'm kind of curious, at what point do HBCUs kind of stop working within the system and start working more to change the system, or kind of start becoming more active in that system, or is kind of breaking away from that model? Are you able to talk about that a little bit?
When you say, when do HBCUs start working outside of the system, do you mean the system at play that says that their institutions are inferior?
Yes.
Or I think they're continuously working against it. And I think there are two things that are happening, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think that there's one thing that's happening that where Black folk in these educational centers don't have to think about what white America is thinking or how they feel. They can just exist. And so I think that there is that model on the campuses that are happening where they're building up their communities in this idea or in this say, everything that they're doing is against the system. Them going to classes to get this education and learn how to read, write, and do these other things, it's going against what the system says that they should or should not have. Them saying that after I finish this undergraduate degree, I'm going to then go on and get a master's degree, or I'm going to go on and study this. I think all of those things are in opposition from what the society at large is saying to perform within. I think that, and even if we just look at Booker T. Washington and Tuskegee, right? And we think about this idea that on one hand, if you look at it just at the surface level, yeah, you can argue that what Washington is teaching at Tuskegee is very similar to the type of training that he received at Hampton. And a lot of that is centered on this industrial type of approach. But then if you look at who is Booker T. Washington hiring, what types of degrees do they have? What other types of classes are being offered? And what types of curriculums are also being instituted at this institution? And so here you have on the outside where they're getting this philanthropic funds based on their agricultural pursuits and based on what they're able to do in the domestic entities. But at the same time, those institutions at Tuskegee or like Tuskegee are also working on a different front of saying, I know this is what I need to do in order to get this money, but we're also working so that we can solve this issue. And we're also working so that we can do this against what the system is saying. So I don't know if that kind of answers what you're asking. But I think that they're
Yeah.
continually working against the system.
Yeah, I think Sheena's comment about there's sort of this divide between, you know, what they might be saying to potential, you know, to white legislatures or to potential benefactors in public, right, is a different issue than what's actually going on campus, and the sort of you know, significance of that. Another way that, you know, another place we can sort of see the impact of Black institutions and Black colleges sort of working against serving as sort of launching pads of opposition to the system is in the way that they often become centers of Black political activity, even in the 19th century, and then of course, you know, to today, through the 20th century. So, for example, at Prairie View in Texas, you know, the Prairie View A&M, they started a Black Teachers Association that Prairie View kind of college faculty and presidents were, you know, basically organizers of, but they went around and had meetings with Black faculty across the state in kind of lower schools as well. And we see that happen in a lot of different southern states where the Black, you know, HBCU was sort of the organizing vessel of other kind of community associations and teachers associations. And then we see, you know, particularly in the example of Texas, but I know Sheena has examples from Alabama where, you know, the Teachers Association then is not only talking about educational policies, but they're also talking about how can we try to shore up Black political rights in the late 19th century as the tide is sort of kind of turning against them and threats of disenfranchisement loom. They're trying to work with, you know, trying to support certain political, you know, candidates and figure out how to negotiate for not only, you know, increased funding for Black schools, but a broader sense of you know, political activism. And that's something that I think also is an ongoing and sort of from the beginning of HBCUs.
Yeah, and Leigh, what I was thinking about when you said the political part is absolutely, it's like a city that has an HBCU and a Black church, that is considered the heart of that Black community at that particular time period. And even if you have a city that does not have a Black church, oftentimes, especially at the turn of the century, there is one on campus, right? And so you also have, in terms of this political realm, where I can remember there are parts where Margaret is publicly saying, the issue of voting has never kept me up at night, right? Like, I'm not concerned really about this notion of voting, and you're not going to find me out here with these women dressed in white picketing in terms of voting, right? And so the way that they showed up was different. In their organizations, though, there are sections on suffrage, right, where they are not only collecting all of this data, but they're disseminating this information to the women and the children and the men within those particular areas, so that when it is time to vote, they're casting their vote. Like, Margaret is taking a line of people to go and cast this vote. And so, just to your point as well, is that you do find them as, we're not just educating folk within the classroom, but this is a community affair of education as well.
So as you're talking about how, you know, they're not just educating people in the classroom, this is part of larger political activity and things like that. This dialogues well with another question that has popped up on Facebook, which is about curriculum offered at HBCUs. This is a question from Dr. Levine here at Mississippi State, and he says, you know, that Leigh, you mentioned kind of the initial agricultural mechanical focus of the Second Morrill Act. But what about times and places where the emphasis is more on teacher training, great books, divinity, law, medicine, you know, those other elements of education?
Is the person asking if the curriculums also included that?
He is talking about, I think, are there particular kinds of curricula that HBCUs have focused on over the years, outside of the Second Moral Act curricula that Lee just mentioned, or mentioned a little bit ago, in our conversation?
Well, first I'd like to just um, maybe clarify a little bit more about that when I talked about the Second Moral Act emphasizing, agricultural and mechanical education, I did not mean to say that any HBCU, even land grant, designated land grant colleges um, for Black Americans, exclusively focused on those programs. They almost always included those kinds of technical or agricultural programs alongside, classical, liberal arts type courses. Of course, teacher training even fell under kind of the moral vision of higher education. Again, it was sort of aimed at the kind of work ordinary Americans might do, and teaching was among that at the time. So I think oftentimes scholars, or historians have tended to kind of draw a dichotomy in the 19th century between kind of liberal arts schools and industrial education, and it's part of this larger conversation in sort of education literature around what is the purpose of education. Is it preparation for a career? Is it fulfillment of the mind, right? Is it a moral education? And for Black Americans in the 19th century, they really didn't spend too much time uh, kind of being picky about those things. They felt like all of these goals are worthy and can help create kind of well-rounded young adults, and especially given that climate of funding scarcity and the need to sort of scrape and scrap for bits of funding wherever they could find it. They might take funding from the Slater Fund, which wanted them to highlight technical education or get land grant funds, but also use private community donations to help support courses on Latin or trigonometry or so they were not picky when it came to there wasn't really room for sort of a rigid idealism when it came to running public Black colleges in the 19th century. And I would say that, for them, they thought it was, the integration of those various curricular branches fit pretty easily into their vision for Black education. Sheena, do you want to add? I know your book talked a little bit more about sort of focus on Black history, and
Yeah,
you want to say more about that?
that's why I was re-asking about the question, because I think it's so many different missions that are in HBCUs, and we see those missions based on where the HBCU is located, how the HBCU is formed, what type of leadership the HBCU has at this particular time period. But you also see these things of how do we educate the whole person, right? Not just how do I give you this book to read and you recite Shakespeare. Like, yeah, that was cool and all, but it was more so on how can I give you just some practical things that you've been denied for all of this time, to just help you to be a self-sufficient citizen, to just help you to understand these things. And so you have some that are then, like Margaret is going to partner with Carter G. Woodson and basically say that an important part of educating students, but also in educating the teachers that are teaching these students, is that there has to be this element of race pride, right? And so this becomes a part of the mission that then becomes a part of the curriculum, because this is seen as experimental, in a way at this particular time period, but it was necessary because they understood that if you didn't like what you saw in the mirror, it didn't matter what I put before you in terms of learning this curriculum or this material. I need to also teach you how to unlearn all of these things that you've been taught in society about yourself and relearn who and what you really are. And so I think you find that infused within the curriculums as well.
That's great. And if I can kind of ask a question on top of that, you're starting to answer it, I think, already. But kind of the idea behind this program was that I read an article in the Chronicle of Higher Education, which said that enrollment, a lot of universities in America struggle with enrollment, but over the past couple of years, the enrollment in HBCUs have just skyrocketed to the points where, they're trying to find ways to house the students and everything like that. And I was just wondering if you could talk to that a little bit more, maybe about why enrollment in HBCUs is so high right now when so many other places are struggling. So keep going.
All right, my position might be a little different, but I think overall we consider HBCUs to be this kind of homogeneous group, right? There are levels of diversity within this unique classification of institutions, not only by academic distinction and socioeconomic status, but also in student demographics. In addition, HBCUs have diverse classifications: public, private, denominational, liberal arts, land grant, independent university system, single gender serving, research based, large, and small, with enrollment numbers that can range from less than 300 to over 11,000 students. I think in addition is that since the tragic deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor in 2020, the public outcry against institutional racism, police brutality, and discrimination has reached into the homes, workplaces, and educational centers across the nation. And I also think that you have just a large number of parents that at that particular time are vowing to now send their children to HBCUs. And oftentimes those cries were coming from parents who were also products of HBCUs themselves. Since 2020, North Carolina A&T State University in Greensboro reported the highest enrollment in the institution's 120-year history. Howard University enjoyed a more than 15% enrollment increase, and Bowie State reported an 8% increase. And with increased enrollment, a few HBCUs have also received historic philanthropic gifts. For example, at Morgan State University in Baltimore, 2 gifts from philanthropists totaled over $60 million. Howard University, Morehouse College, and Tuskegee University are also among the HBCUs who have received public gifts since 2020. However, I think to the point that I sort of danced around earlier, I think that the narrative of HBCUs is that they will be okay despite the minimal support that they get. And we often talk about one, right? And we say, oh, this one is getting this. That means that they're all getting it, right? And while we hear about the historic philanthropic acts paid toward HBCUs, I think in the wake of this social injustices, only a few are recipients of these gifts. A great majority of HBCUs are not recipients. And in like manner, a great majority of HBCUs are not experiencing a growth of enrollment. And so I think that that's important in balancing it out, because sometimes if we hear HBCU, they can be talking about 3, and it's 101 of them. And so 3 on 101, where it's an increased enrollment and the student population that they typically have is under 1,000, and then it's moved to 1,100. We can talk about that, but I think that it has to be in isolation, right? So it would have to be Howard University, which is an HBCU, has experienced 15% growth. Why? And then it's going to be a number of different reasons for that. One, Howard's administration. They've been making a lot of hard choices within the last few years. The climate that's happening, right? Here you have a vice president of the United States who is a graduate of Howard University. That matters. And so I think that in answering that question, it it forces us to think about them individually, as opposed to blanketly saying that they all are experiencing this growth, because they're not.
Yeah, I think, Sheena, you covered a lot that I would have wanted to say, and then some. The only thing I want to add is the reality of the pandemic and the financial hardship that many Americans have undergone over the past couple of years. And I think one thing that HBCUs have done and continue to do is offer quality education at an affordable price. And I think that's my guess, is that that is also, you know, something that's been driving increased enrollment for some HBCUs in the past recently. But I think Sheena's point is well taken and important, that, yes, there may be increases in enrollment and high profile donations for some HBCUs, but overall they remain
In dire need.
yeah, in dire need and really vulnerable to ongoing sort of budget constraints, the vagaries of state support for and federal support for higher education, and we're really likely to lose many HBCUs if we don't sort of pay more attention and kind of stem the tide.
Right. No, I really appreciate that, because I walked away from the article thinking, wow, HBCUs are doing great, like all of them everywhere. And I had not thought that maybe it was just picking a couple of key institutions and focusing on that. So thank you for clarifying that. But also, I think now we've kind of moved into kind of a different part of the conversation where you mentioned that some of the increased enrollment in HBCUs might be in response to the social injustices that have been especially highlighted recently, and things like that. And I've noticed just here at Mississippi State and in other non-HBCU institutions of higher education that there have been, kind of very intense efforts at increasing diversity and inclusion there. And in fact, diversity and inclusion has kind of become like, I'm not even 100% sure if we all know what that means anymore, but we throw those words around a lot. And so I was just wondering if either of you have any opinions on whether these attempts at increasing diversity and inclusion in universities have been successful. Has this made a difference in the way that Black Americans experience education? Are there other efforts that we should be making at non-HBU institutions to improve education in that level?
Okay, so it's a couple of ways that we can go about this one. I think that sometimes words that are well intentioned sometimes just become buzzwords, right? And so you can't step on any campus without saying diversity and inclusion, to the point where it's like no one knows what it means. We just say it, diversity and inclusion, diversity. Like they hired a Black person, diversity and inclusion. Like I don't know what they do, but they're diversified.
It's a good thing,
right?
Yeah.
And it's just like, I think that ultimately, if we're talking about changes, that even as we're discussing it as a buzzword, it's going to have some deeper roots. And so what I'll say to that also is that even before the discussion of George Floyd or Breonna Taylor, right, you had a number of protests at PWI campuses. Many of their students took to the streets and spoke out against the lack of diversity and inclusion on their campuses, despite, I think, the ushering in of these new diversity and inclusion programs. For example, you had the hashtag Black at Harvard, the hashtag Black at Yale, where Black students shared their stories of microaggressions and blatant racism within these institutions. I think that these things occurred around the same time as the height of the Black Lives Matter movement. And the clearest example kind of that is the Michael Brown protest that's happening in St. Louis. And shortly after that, you have the eruption of student protest at Mizzou, which is the state flagship institution. I think that some often believe that HBCUs are sort of like this prehistoric relic of the era of segregation, right? And oftentimes when we think about them, we think, hey, how are they? Do we need them still? If we have these well-intentioned, predominantly white institutions that can also provide for the general public. And I think part of my answer is very similar to the answer of integration, of what happens to those Black missions, what happens to those Black teachers, what happens when you displace them with this idea that we can all just lump into one because we think of education the same way. And I think that in some ways, that in connection to sort of the importance or the relevance of HBCUs also comes to mind, because it's almost like HBCUs and Black bodies are within our society are constantly having to prove their relevance, or their significance, or their legitimacy, whereas other institutions are seen as normative, permanent, and in need, and there's no need to ever think about should they still exist, right? Or if an HBCU adds a program, I don't think the conversation becomes, since there's this program at this HBCU, then we no longer need that program at a PWI. Actually, we don't need the PWI, and everyone can come to the HBCU. And so because these questions don't happen back and forth, and they're always at HBCUs, I think that one way in terms of partnerships, and there are a number of partnerships that exist right now with collaborations between PWIs and HBCUs, especially with creating centers around diversity and inclusion. You have a number of partnerships in that way. You also have a number of partnerships in terms of class offerings, where one school may offer a certain degree and another school offers a different degree, and they work in concert with one another to ensure that that person has a dual degree, right? And so you have colleges and universities that are working on that way. I think one way that a PWI can use its many resources, and oftentimes their resources are just greater than the resources that are at HBCUs, to then step into their space and say, how can I be of service? Right? How can I create programming that matters to the students that you serve? Right? Because I ultimately want to be in community with those same folk, because this is our community. And so I think sometimes it's the approach of how do we do it, and not in a sense of we've perfected it, now we no longer need you. Right? And so I think that's kind of my approach to that, and sort of like partnership. A lot of the partnership is going to be resources. What are some resources that can be shared, and how do we come to the table without thinking that this is the model and that this one is not, right? And so that's my 2 cents on it.
I so appreciate everything you just said, Sheena. And I want to add that, in addition to this idea of sharing resources, I think an important first step for predominantly white institutions, historically white institutions, is to acknowledge the exclusionary racist history of their own institutions and their own existence. So, for instance, I'd be remiss not to mention, I'm sure, a lot of anyone here who works at Mississippi State or attends school here has probably heard about our first president, a man named Stephen Lee. Julia, you've probably seen he's honored around campus with statues. His bust is prominently displayed on the drill field, buildings and roadways named after him. But right, what these sites and signs don't mention is that Stephen Lee spent years promoting a revisionist version of history that glorified the Confederate cause. He was a former Confederate general. And while he served as president of Mississippi State, which He served until 1899, so for almost 20 years. He was working to solidify the lost cause narrative of the Civil War, and he helped orchestrate the disenfranchisement of Black Mississippians in the 1890 state constitution. And I think his story is a reminder to us of what Black educational activists knew all too well in the 19th century, which is that the founders of Mississippi State University and other prominent white education officials never intended public higher education to be diverse or equitable, right? Black Mississippians had to struggle and to build their own institutions in order to have access to schooling at all. And then still those institutions remained systematically under-resourced. So, I would say that before Mississippi State, can really truly tout its diversity and inclusion initiatives, I'd like to see it really reckon with its own history and take meaningful steps to repair generations of exclusion and inequity in Mississippi public higher education more broadly.
Absolutely, I agree.
And Leigh, if I could ask a follow-up question there, what would some of this reckoning look like to you? Like what kind of, do you have in your mind, I don't know, programs or, visual elements on campus, or, things like that, that would exhibit that kind of reckoning that you're looking for?
So I have a few ideas. When I spoke earlier about all the ways that Stephen Lee sort of honored on campus without context, and if I'd love to see, I know that there are student petitions to have the bust removed, for instance. So students are themselves very active on this campus, and they're the reason we had the state flag removed before I got here. But either to have the bust removed or I'd love to see, very similar to conversations that happened over the last decade around what to do with Confederate monuments. There have been other interesting ideas about ways to can we put the bust on its head and have some kind of, make an art installation around it that puts something in conversation with it. And as opposed to just a little plaque that sort of gives more contextual information, do something a little more creative and that can really make a statement and draw people's attention to that context. I'd love to see that. I'd love to see more programs like this across the university. I'd really like to see, and I am fairly new to Mississippi State, so pardon my ignorance if some of these things already take place, but I'd love to see Mississippi State think about not just what it can take from HBCUs, but what it can give. So for instance, there's often talk around wanting to recruit, top students from HBCUs or faculty, but also to think about, what can a school like Mississippi State give to an HBCU as opposed to just take? How can they, much like what Sheena was talking about, show up and say, how can we serve you? How might we, give you access to, top equipment, facilities, resources, library materials, as well as sort of have an exchange. I know some universities do have sort of like a student exchange program with HBCUs. There's lots of HBCUs right here in Mississippi. And I'd be interested to learn more about what Mississippi State is doing to partner with them, but my suspicion is that they could be doing even more.
And then kind of just to follow up right on what you were saying, Leigh, we have another question in the chat talking about this, but in the context of sports. So I'll just ask the question and see if you have thoughts to share. This question is from Worth Harris, and it is, do you think certain HBCUs, mainly focusing on schools in the SWAC or the MEAC, could possibly open up a door of important funding that could help their schools by way of their football programs by choosing to participate in the NCAA playoffs and compete for a 1AA national championship. They currently just send their conference champions to a random bowl game in Atlanta. Do they shoot themselves financially by doing this? And if so, why? As cool as it is seeing people like Deion Sanders and Eddie George come back and coach these schools, I wish they could have the chance to win championships and get that paycheck from the NCAA that could go towards a lot of good in the community. So I don't know if either of you have thoughts to share there.
I know it's political.
Okay.
I know that they're not choosing to make less or be not included. I know that much. I don't know any of the technical on in terms of like sports bring in a certain amount of money for the institution. And I think that's just really kind of across the board is that sports programs bring in a considerable amount of the funding for those institutions. I don't know if the question is asking, should HBCUs not allow themselves to be pigeonholed into certain conferences because bigger conferences would yield more funding? I think that one of the issues, and Leigh, you could take it as well, but I think that one of the issues that also is happening is that HBCU athletes are in competition with PWI athletes in the sense that they can offer bigger packages and things of that sort. And so a number of the athletes are typically not coming into HBCUs, they're going to PWIs. And so I think that's another realm of it as well. But I'm not as versed.
But it sounds like this might be just another example of what you were talking about is that, rather than just, kind of go out and recruit, all the good athletes and offer them big packages and whatever it is they do to get someone to want to come to a PWI university to play sports, they could do things that, well, how can we help you increase and enrich your sports programs or things like that?
Right.
Okay, great. We have one more question to go, and it's using a term that I myself am not particularly familiar with, but I'd like to throw it out and see if you have thoughts to share on it, and then we'll probably start to bring things to a close. Unless there are any more questions out there, now is your last chance to put a question in that little box underneath the video for Dr. Harris or for Dr. Soares. But this question is saying, at some point, please discuss the deficit model in education and some of the negative implications it can have on students. Are HBCU faculty less likely to subscribe to such a model? And I'm afraid I'm not particularly familiar with that model. I don't know if either of you have heard it discussed.
The deficit model in education.
Yeah. If Leigh?
I'm a little rusty. I probably the person asking the question could explain it better. My understanding is that that it refers to a framing of education that talks about, what students are lacking, so kind of a more negative framing. So like when you talk about disadvantaged schools or disadvantaged students or school districts, that framing, if I'm correct, if I'm remembering correctly, would fall under that sort of deficit model of in education. And now I've forgotten what the overall question was, besides just figuring out what that phrase is. But I think the question was about, are HBCU teachers less likely to have that framework?
Yes.
Again, I think it's hard to kind of paint with a broad brush, but I would say that from the perspective of 19th century Black Americans, certainly that was their expectation, that they would, be much more likely, for their students to feel empowered and have a sense of pride in themselves and their communities with a Black teacher at the head of the classroom, as opposed to a white teacher, and particularly, a white Southerner. So certainly that, I think, was the was one idea behind the push for all Black faculty in Black schools at every level of education. And I would imagine that remains a conversation that educators and leaders are having around the country. There's a real interest in sort of minority faculty, recruitment and retention, especially in K-12. And I would think that this idea of, the value that, kind of having a teacher that sort of looks like you or, can, instill in you a sense of pride in yourself and your community and your future, right? That's really important for children.
Yeah. And I think to add to what you were saying, Leigh, is that I think that was also one of the things in terms of cultural understanding is that oftentimes you'll have folks that are from that same community and are that understand the community that the students are coming from as well, which is going to impact the way that they teach them. Oh, Johnny can read. Johnny needs this, right? And I think that you also get that in the classroom. It was something else that I was thinking about when you said that, Leigh. It just escaped me. But yes, I think that you ultimately do have that that mission that is unspoken that basically says that we're going to take these students where they are and then we're going to get them into this area that they need to be in. And that means that if I need to do an extra session of lectures after class or during a night session, especially 19th early, you were doing that, right? And so you have these night schools that are attempting to fill that gap that's happening, that's not there during the day school sessions. And so I don't know if they were asking it in that way, if we answered it.
I think you've addressed kind of the general idea that the person was going for. I've been looking to see if they wanted to elaborate a little bit more, and I haven't seen anything yet. So hopefully that means that within what you were discussing, which was very useful and valuable in and of itself, you've also addressed that question they were trying to ask. So we're a little bit over time already. It's just flown by because this has been such a fascinating conversation. And just for myself as a university professor, I'm ashamed to admit I did not know anything much at all about HBCUs until after I started teaching here at Mississippi State. And then it's been a very slow learning curve because a lot of times I don't think we broadly in the university system talk about HBCUs the same way that we talk about other PWIs. And this is something that I'm really suddenly starting to recognize. And it's making me really interested in learning more. So I very much appreciate taking some time to talk to me today and to answer the questions of the folks who are out there. Are there any other things that you would like to talk about regarding HBCUs or diversity in education? Or any other points that you would like to go back to or closing thoughts that you have?
No, I think I'll close with I'm excited that you invited me here to talk about my little knowledge of HBCUs and sort of my experience with working with the scholarship on it. I think that it's important that we do have these conversations and so that things don't just become words or we're checking these proverbial boxes to say that we've done something in something. But I'm always hopeful that conversations actually lead to action. And so I'm excited to be a part of that as well.
Okay, great. Well, thank you both very much. And I'll just end with a part of a comment that we had on Facebook during this conversation. And the comment says that, there is a priceless culture of care from multiple underserved communities that's imparted inside HBCUs. Thank you so much for continuing to tell this important story. So hopefully this is just going to be, one chapter, one element of an ongoing narrative that we can keep building and an ongoing conversation we can keep having about education like this. And again, thank you both so much. And Dr. Harris, can you remind us all one more time what the title of your book is?
It's called Margaret Murray Washington, The Life and Career of a Club Woman.
All right, great. Well, I will be looking out for that book. I know it was just published.
Yes.
Because now I'm very excited to read about it and
I
learn
was like,
more.
I have a picture.
Show us.
Oh, there it is.
Fantastic. Fantastic. I think we need that in the Institute for Humanities library. And Leigh, I know that your book is in progress, but hopefully at some point we can circle back and we can talk about yours when it is ready to be read. Fantastic.
Yes.
Well, again, thank you both so much. I really appreciate you being here, and thank you very much to the people who have asked comments or asked questions or put comments in the chat box. I'll be looking forward to seeing y'all at the next program. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.